Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp, and I'm the Chief Digital Manager, Digital Officer of DATAVERSITY. We would like to thank you for joining this DATAVERSITY webinar, Navigating AI Governance, Building Robust Policies for the Future. Just a couple of points to get us started. Due to the large number of people that attend these sessions, you will be muted during the webinar. For questions, we'll be collecting them via the Q&A. And if you'd like to chat with us or with each other, we certainly encourage you to do so. And just a note, Zoom defaults the chat to send to just the panelists, but you may absolutely change that to network with everyone. To find the Q&A and chat panels, you can find those icons in the bottom middle of your screen for those features. And as always, we will send a follow-up email within 2 business days containing links to the slides, the recording of this session, and any additional information requested throughout the webinar. Now, let me introduce to you our speaker for the webinar, Mark Horstman. Mark is a data management professional and CDMP practitioner with over 20 years of experience and acts as the data evangelist for DATAVERSITY. You guys have heard him already. Many of you are already familiar with him as he's been hosting many of our webinars. Mark moved into data quality, master data management, and data governance early in his career and has been working extensively in data management since both the early 2000s. Previous to his work at DATAVERSITY, Mark led information management initiatives in both public and private sector organizations. And with that, I will give the floor to Mark to get today's webinar started. Hello and welcome.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Shannon. And I was just watching chat, and I'll make an attempt to watch chat during the presentation, but I can't promise anything. But yeah, we do have a white paper available for download for this, and we have a large number of templates available for this. And it's one of these things that I get excited about. And if you've been in webinars or classes with me before, sometimes I get excited about ridiculous things. And one of the ridiculous things I get excited about is policies, procedures, and guidelines. I guess I was just built differently. But today, what I want to do is talk about some policy basics, some procedure and guideline basics. I'm going to share with everybody, and the white paper shares with everybody, some templates that I like to use, just to highlight things that I like to document during the policy, procedure, and guideline writing process. Your home organization probably has their own policy templates and so on, but it just highlights a few things that I like to document. But I also like to get into some specific AI things to consider, especially as it relates to procedures and documentation artifacts. But I also want to highlight that, hey, policy isn't a one-person show. We're all in this together, and a team is going to produce a much better result than an individual. So we're going to start today with building a policy team. And look at this wonderful graphic that we have right in the middle of this slide. All right, so why a team? Ultimately, this kind of policy framework, especially for AI, is going to impact your entire organization. No one person generally has that entire organizational view in their heads. And AI governance really impacts a lot of people at an organization, and you need champions. You need a broad view for that policy to make sense. And when I say you need champions, when you put together a policy team, you've got representation from all over the organization. And in this sense, you get this free change management piece where you've got individual folks who've contributed to that policy, worked hard on that policy to make sure that different facets and silos in your organization can work with that policy framework, but they can be champions for it and get people excited for it across the organization. So when you're putting together this team, you get to lean on data governance a little bit. So if you've got a data governance program at your organization, if you don't, hold your questions because I'm going to talk about that in a hot second. But if you do have data governance at your organization, you've got that council or steering committee that you can tap and create an ad hoc working group to work on policies, procedures, and guidelines. It's one of the things that governance is wonderful at. But that council, that organization, that data governance program represents the entire organization. And it gives you such a wonderful communication vector for working on policies, procedures, and guidelines. So leverage governance. So how do you leverage governance? there's a lot of one-on-one conversations that you have with folks. You make sure it's on your next governance council meeting agenda. You want to build a team. Usually, like my sweet spot was always like 5, 6 folks. And one of the most fun things I've ever done working on policy, procedure, and guidelines was like working together on a draft, but then bringing everybody together in a working group. I'd I'd book like a small, dingy room with like comfy chairs and a ridiculous projector or a glass whiteboard, and we would just kind of workshop through different pieces that we had drafted in. But that nice tight knit group of folks that represent the entire organization generally is the perfect number. Like, you don't want too many people involved because you'll have way too many folks working on just, oh, we need to add this, or we need to remove this, or we need to change how this is working. So you can get too much analysis paralysis if you've got too many people involved. You do want to make sure that outside of that working group and outside of the council, that you've got some communication as to what the direction is for policy statements at the executive level. And like, if you're missing folks from your policy working group, the executive team can kind of really help get that engagement from folks that you might be missing, so they can help recognize people in your organization who also should be on that group. But like I said, that sweet spot is about 6 folks. So no data governance program. What the heck do we do? How do we do it without governance? Well, all it is it's like the same activity, but it's a little bit more work, and you got to drink a little bit more coffee. Uh, so ideally, what you want to do is work with your executives. Your executives are demanding an AI governance policy, or a policy reflection on how AI is impacting your organization. So you've got that championship already. You've got that support. It's a matter of talking to that executive team and starting to recognize people who are important and vital to include in your policy writing team. So doing it without governance, it's just more one-on-one discussions, more making sure that you've kind of covered all your bases, that you've got everybody involved. Maybe you've got to get legal working on the team with you. I've always included legal and policy writing, but your mileage may vary. It may be a different cultural impact at your organization, but like, are we including legal? Are we including finance in this? Are we including HR in this? Our customer data specialist, are they involved in this? Our IT folks, like, who are the main movers and shakers as it relates to rolling out AI at your organization that need to be involved in the policy writing? You gotta understand those folks. Without governance, you don't have any freebies. You gotta go and do the work, and go out and have those one-on-one discussions. Make sure people are engaged. They're champions of this as well, and warm them up to working with the group. And like I say, executive engagement. If there's demand for this, you're working on it, there's demand for it. If an executive said, hey, we need this, there's demand for it. And because they're asking for it, they're going to be able to help you out. They're going to be able to help you find those, recognize those key folks that you need to get involved in that policy writing group. All right. So how do we run the team? The one thing I've always liked to do when writing policy is I would take a first crack at it myself. So this goes against what I just said. But Mark, you said holistic overview of the entire organization. What are you doing writing it by yourself? Well, really, the initial draft is really about focusing everybody's ideas on something. So you got to start somewhere. You don't want to send people into an empty document with no kind of a lead in. So having that initial draft and putting some ideas to paper is going to really give everybody a sense of some overall direction, and things are gonna kind of ebb and flow from there. So encourage people to work independently after you've got that initial draft. Have people put track changes on. this is one of my personal pet peeves though, track changes. Oh, those red underlines, they drive me nuts. But it's an effective way to work independently and collaborate on a single document, kind of go back and forth. Everybody's kind of putting their ideas in. And then every once in a while, you book that, like maybe once a week even, or a couple of times a week if you're on a tight timeline to get something out. Book a collaborative room. So like that dingy little room that I was talking about, massive glass whiteboard, fun little projector, just something for everybody to collaborate on that policy framework together. So initial draft it out yourself, get everybody to work independently on it, but then bring everybody to work together, and then repeat between working together and working independently. Great. So somebody's going to add in a perfect definition for this. We need a procedure statement for this, or we need a policy statement that highlights this. So what are my tips and tricks for writing policy just in general? So we've got a couple of templates that we're going to send everybody. They're linked right in the white paper that's attached to this webinar. We're also going to link them in chat here throughout the course of chat or through the course of this webinar. But when we talk about policy, there's some key sections that we want to consider. So we have a policy statement very early on in the document. So the policies statements are very short. You want to make sure that they're brief. Like just an overall statement of the organization's belief about AI governance, for example. It's going to be approximately a paragraph. Really, your goal is to be able to quickly explain the policy in simple terms. So if you've got like a little tally chart, you're keeping track at home, you can say, you count how many times they say, have mercy. Have mercy on the poor people who are reading your policy. My gosh, nobody wants to come and read 80 pages of policy documents. Nobody does that in any organization. You can make it as required as you want. You definitely want to impart something meaningful about the policy in that first section, in those simple terms that are easy to communicate. You want to give people a basic sense of why this policy even exists in the first place. Make it easy to understand. Moving into the template, but another thing that's important to capture in your policy document is the scope. When does this policy apply? Who does it apply to? But whenever I talk about scope in any context, I like to challenge people to think about who it doesn't apply to, or when it doesn't apply, and be specific about those cases. So if this is AI governance and we're working with contractors and we have a statement about using LLMs to produce content, well, great. Well, what does that mean? Does it apply to our employees in our organization? Does it apply to contractors differently? Do we expect contractors to declare that they're using LLMs, but the rules are a little bit different for them? Maybe that's the case. If we have specific scope rules related to how we're implementing policy at our organization, we need to include those. And my biggest challenge, if you remember anything from today other than have mercy on the poor people that read your policies, remember scope. Challenge yourself to think of things that are out of scope. All right, moving off my soapbox, climbing off my scope soapbox here. That sounds like a joke. Anyway, definitions. So definitions are a very critical aspect of your policy document. Truth be told, most policy documents that I've written, I've spent more time on definitions than actual policy statements, which sounds a little bit funny. But when we're talking about specific things at an organization like AI governance, what the heck is AI? What are we talking about when a policy statement says AI? We need to be specific here. Like some of these can be easy and you can coalesce around something that you can dig up from the internet, that's fine. At least, or you could at least start from that. But maybe your local interpretation of large language model or small language model has some nuance in your organization and you want to capture that. That's absolutely fine. You have to include that there so that when people read the scope state or the policy statements and then the policy pieces in your document, they understand what you're talking about. There's a clear conformed business language. Everybody's referring to the same thing, and it needs to be right in that policy statement. This can be the hardest section to actually write when it comes down to it. Every single term, every single little bit of jargon needs a definition attached to it, or have mercy on your poor readers. Like, how do they know what they're reading? So, writing definitions as a team. So, I do like to have a slide with this. Our good friend Bob Seiner likes to talk about cheeseburger definitions. I love this too. A cheeseburger definition. The definition of a cheeseburger is a burger with cheese. Don't do that. Apply some context to what something means. I was talking to somebody about customer email as a business glossary definition. And don't just say that customer email is the customer's email. This is the email address captured during the process of onboarding a new customer record or something. Like give it some context, give it some business meaning that's more than just the vapid. I can tell what this is based on its name alone. Although you should try to have some intrinsic meaning when you name things, but the point of a definition is to provide some more context and knowledge. Don't just go crazy. Um, you know, when you start writing these definitions, grab something from the internet. Um, uh, does that culturally work in your organization? Does the definition make sense? These are all good things to start. Take a copy of this slide. We'll send the slides out after. Uh, all good things to capture here. When I say the goal is to keep these short, this is going to be repeated throughout this webinar today. Have mercy on your policy readers. Somebody's got to read that thing. Nobody's sitting down at your organization saying, I feel like reading policy today. You want to be able to communicate what the policy means to somebody. The best way to communicate policy is to keep statements short and meaningful and complete. It's a huge writing challenge to keep things short and meaningful. So that's why, initial draft, work independently, work together. As you work together and you start to blow up a policy framework, suddenly you're at 80 pages. Nobody's going to read that. The challenge is to get your policy statement or your policy document down to something like 5 pages. And then kind of go from there. And I'll tell you the secret sauce and how to do that in a second. But I've literally done that. I've taken an 80-page policy draft and taken it down to 5 pages. It's a lot of writing work. So principles. So as we put in all of that other work into our policy, the principles, this is the main body of our policy statement. This is laying out our organization's position on what we're writing about, AI governance. This section can be long, but it doesn't need to be. Each statement should be short, and you can have dozens of statements. You can have related statements, so you can have little bullet points around there. So the writing challenge here is to be specific and still brief. You want to reference procedures or guidelines. We'll talk about those in a second. But you want to reference applicable regulations and legislation as well. So you've got your principal statements. In the template, I also have a related documents section. You want to provide links to all of those legislative pieces right in that policy document. You want to make sure everything that you're talking about is referenced. This is the secret to keeping your policy document short. If you're linking off to other procedures and guidelines or linking off to other referenced works like regulations, legislation, Then the folks who just need to know the organization's position on a topic, but don't necessarily need to follow a specific procedure or guideline for their day-to-day work, then they can skip that part. You're not hitting them in the face with it and forcing them to read it to get through the policy. You're just saying, hey, here's where that is. Go read it if you need to do X. And so just for a little bit of verbiage here, when I talk about procedures and guidelines and policy, I mean like the whole procedure framework or the whole framework at your organization. So you've got your policy on AI governance. Perhaps you have a procedure in place that policy references, and that procedure says, hey, this is how you disclose use of AI when producing content. This is exactly how you do that. So a procedure is generally that set of steps that one must follow, where a guideline is like a softer version of that. And being able to enhance your policy with specific procedures and guidelines makes it a more readable document, and the people who need to follow those specific procedures and guidelines can link off into them. I'm going to talk more about that right away here. So I mentioned briefly the related documents. So procedures and guidelines are like children of this policy. Make sure you reference all of them that are related to this policy framework right in the policy. If you're linking off to legislation or regulations, link off to those as well. This is a personal preference that I like to do. I like to include audit controls and document history in a lot of these policies. Depending on how your organization culturally manages policies, you may have a yearly policy review or a twice-a-year policy review. So if the policy was reviewed, when was it reviewed last? If it's changed, what has changed last? Who changed it? Who approved the change? Like all of those nice little auditing things and document history. It's nice to have those in there. It'll make future you happy. So if somebody claims, yeah, I read the policy and I was following it, but I was doing it back in August of last year, and August of last year, this happened to be the rule. And well, actually, we haven't changed it since August. We reviewed it, but the review said no change is necessary. And so whenever you have any kind of internal discussions about when something came into effect, that can be resolved quickly with audit controls. I like to audit pretty much everything I do, mostly to prevent weird discussions like that from taking up valuable space in my brain. I'm protecting future me by not having conversations that are not so exciting. So when we talk about AI governance specifics, I've got some links here. We link to some of these in the white paper as well. But there are some specific things happening in AI right now. So the European Commission, the folks that brought us GDPR over in the EU, have the AI Act. Up here in Canada, we're working on an AI Act as well. And then you can just kind of see out in the wild, there are some interesting things happening in AI. It was almost a year ago now, not quite, just a few months ago, when we had the writers' strike. I think that was last summer, I want to say, and that was resolved. But there were some interesting things that happened in that settlement. So, hey, yeah, you can use AI, but you have to disclose its use. A production house can't use only AI with no human in the loop. Like all of those kinds of things were a very interesting takeaway from those stories. Some of the key trends that I've seen is that disclosure of use piece. I do want to talk a little bit about model transparency. So what I mean by that, and you can see it both in what we're doing here in Canada, but as well as in the Europeans are doing, is if an AI model selects somebody as part of a population selection or processes somebody's data in a particular way, there needs to be a way to describe how that happened. So the AI can't just exist as a black box that says this is why we believe that this person is likely to purchase this product. Like, we can't just live in a world where it's a black box and says, okay, here's everybody that meets your criteria. So that model transparency is becoming a huge feature in these regulations that are coming out. Now, the other thing that we like to classically consider in AI, before even the days of LLMs, is bias. And there's so many stories of how bias can impact AI. I've got so many personal stories about bias. We can get into those at another juncture here, but one of the early examples of bias in AI was when we were using data science and machine learning to do facial recognition, and those models were trained on white faces. And so if you were a white person, then this facial recognition software would work wonderfully. And if you weren't, then it didn't. And like that bias is just absolutely a reputation killer. Um, Bias plays a huge role in everybody's regulations right now, because we do want to consider the overall accessibility and reasonableness, and we're not unfairly targeting minority groups by throwing data at an uncaring, unethical AI. Um, we can get into ethics of AI later, but if we're not training our data on a representative data set, then our AI can do some incredibly awful things. So bias is something to consider when we're putting together our policy framework. We're going to get into procedure basics soon here, but when it comes to AI, there are a number of things that you want your policy framework to capture, and there's a lot of resources out there that'll give you like a sense of different frameworks and things. But as you're working on a policy framework for AI, I want you to consider um, cases at your organization where AI is actively being used. Are we, is this particular software tool, does it have AI in it? A great example is Copilot. We started using Copilot at our organization in our Microsoft environment. So great, wonderful. What does that mean? What does that, can users just use it? What does that mean for our organization? What are the procedures or guidelines related to the usage of Copilot? Have mercy on your users. Communicate with them using your policies, procedures, and guidelines, and say, hey, here's the rules of engagement for how we're using this model. One of the things that I'd like you to consider too is kind of like data governance, where we talk about data owners, somebody who's ultimately accountable for data at an organization. Well, who's ultimately accountable at your organization for that particular use of that particular AI model? Whether it's an LLM like Copilot or ChatGPT or Bard or whatever, um, um, or if it's a data science model that's recommending products to folks. There's got to be somebody who's ultimately accountable for the running and operation and care and feeding of that. So there are specific things that you may want to enshrine in policy to document when it comes to the use of AI at your organization. So procedure basics. So we have a template for that as well. So a procedure is very similar to a policy, but it's a child document, and I've set it up that way in the template. So a procedure should always be attached to a specific policy, and that procedure really gives you a sense of what somebody's supposed to do when they're following the policy. So it's going to have a purpose and background statement. Why does this procedure exist? Goal again is to be brief. Have mercy on your users. Somebody's got to read this thing. That nobody's as excited as we are when it comes to reading our policies, procedures, and guidelines. Uh, uh, the definitions. You don't want to have people flip back and forth between multiple documents to see the definitions of the words that you're using in your procedure document. So just because you've defined something in policy already, put that definition in your procedure document as well. If you've got a futuristic or advanced content management system, you can link all of these things together so that the definitions only need to be updated in one place. If you don't, you got to make sure you update all your child documents, which good for you. You've already documented all the related documents to your procedure document and your policy document, so you know which ones you need to update. That's a case where auditing controls and related documents make future you happy. But those definitions, like I said, have mercy on your users. They don't want to open up another browser window to go back to that other document that they linked off to just so that they can read a definition again. Make sure you include everything. So procedures really are specific statements about how a task is carried out. So if I like the LLM example for AI governance. If I need to disclose the use of an LLM, what are the procedures? What are the exact ways that I need to carry out that disclosure? Who do I need to notify? How do I notify them? What am I allowed to do? The goal here, and this is where people can really get tripped up writing policy, procedure, and guidelines. When you're implementing a policy framework, sometimes the the need or the demands get on you to to write this like you're living in sunshine, unicorns, and rainbows land, and everything you write down is going to be that's the perfect utopia, and everybody's going to be able to follow this. Sorry, I see in chat, what is an LLM? That's a large language model, like chat GPT is an example of an LLM. Sorry about the acronym. But when we're writing these procedures and policies as well, but procedures especially, they have to be followable. They have to be reasonably practicable. If you want your users to actually do something specific, it's got to be something that they can actually do at their desk when they're working with the content. If you make something too hard, it's not going to be followed. Even if you have the most iron-fisted policy framework and disciplinary group available, if something is difficult to do, it's not going to be done. So be reasonably practicable when putting your procedures together. Again, I want to challenge everybody, kind of like when I was talking about scope earlier. Are there exceptions to this procedure? When is it not to be followed? And really go down that thought exercise of when we shouldn't be doing this. Is there a case when this procedure shouldn't be followed? Also, kind of further to that, there will be cases where an exception to that procedure will spring up and you won't have thought of it. So you need to include in your procedure document how to ask for an ad hoc or a unique exception and who is responsible for that. So again, like, who's ultimately accountable for this model? Who is the steward of the model? You can see some of the similarities and how you borrow from data governance in some of this. But AI governance, you're going to have slightly different roles and responsibilities. But again, who am I talking to if I need an exception to this? Important thing to document in your procedure. Again, related documents, you want to link back to your parent policy. You want to reference any related policies. Like if your procedure has a disciplinary action attached to it, some procedures do, make sure you link to applicable HR policies and procedures. Like anything that users may need further information on, make sure you have it in the related documents. It'll make everybody's life easier. Again, I love the audit controls here. who approved it when was it reviewed, and the footer, what has changed when, so we have a history. What I like about a high level procedure or policy document and then further details in procedures and guidelines is it's a lot easier generally to manage changes to a procedure than it is to promote and authorize and approve and communicate a change to a policy itself. So policies you generally want to be a little bit more durable than a procedure or guideline. And procedures and guidelines, you can generally set up a culture where those are reviewed and updated more frequently. Like I said, if you have an exception to a procedure, is that exception going to be added in to that procedure document? Maybe you've got something that can have some enduring value added to that procedure for users in the future to prevent people from needlessly having to email asking for people's approval for an exception all the time when it's an activity that you know is happening at your organization now. So that fluidity and that ability to have something that's cohesive, but you can actually modify and make changes to procedures and guidelines more often is rather freeing and helpful to your users. Again, like I've been saying, have mercy on your poor users. They're just trying to follow the policy. If you make it easy for them by respecting the types of work that they're doing and respecting the cases where they've had to ask for exceptions and understanding those, listening to them, applying that feedback into those documents easily, users are going to be much happier folks for it. So I've mentioned procedures and guidelines a bit. I'm not going to get into a ton of details with guidelines. Suffice to say that they're essentially like more lighter procedure documents. They're not giving you necessarily thou shalt do this way. Think of a guideline as more of a passively worded general rules of engagement for doing something. So they're useful for expanding on a policy and giving more context and some specific pointers to users, and allows you to kind of take some bloat out of the policy document itself. It's a guideline. It's giving people guidance on how the policy should be followed. That's your writing goal here. And I use pretty much the exact same sections as I do for a procedure document. And we'll have that handed out to you as well. Actually, I see Shannon just posted it in chat. So thank you, Shannon. So for AI governance specifically, for general or sorry, generative generative AI. So that's your large language model. Um, um, a lot of drive for AI governance has happened because Gen AI became popular in the last few years, and has really kind of changed the way that people are starting to work. But when we talk about procedures, be specific about what people can put into prompts. What I mean by that is there are cases where when you're using AI engines and putting data into a prompt, that data goes out into the real world. One time, a friend of mine working at an organization, they were working on cleaning up the grammar for a proposal in this particular example, a wastewater um, um, uh, uh, contract, a wastewater contract for a small town. And so they were detailing a bunch of things in this document, and that's fine. And then they put it into Chat GPT just to clean up the grammar. Engineers are not the best writers in the world. Apologies to any engineers in the crowd, but it's true. And so he's like, yeah, let's clean up my grammar and make sure that this is readable. That's wonderful, and got a great result out of the LLM. Good, everybody's happy. And then he was curious a couple of days later. I wonder, like, if I asked it to write a proposal for wastewater in a small town, what it would produce. And so he did, and he started getting bits of his proposal back from the machine. So you want to be specific about what people can and can't put into prompts. I've heard horror stories of people putting customer information from a spreadsheet into a large language model prompt, like personal details, name, birth date, and then those LLMs reproducing that content to other users. So this is why a policy framework is important to protect and de-risk AI usage at your organization. So be specific when you're writing your policy framework about the tasks that you can use Gen AI for. When I was talking earlier about who's ultimately accountable for this AI, what is its usage, that's when you're documenting these things in policy, and when you're documenting these things in an organization, you can have those discussions about the types of things that you need to document for those models. Is this model, is all of the data we put into this staying locally within our organization? Is none of it going out? Well, great, let's write that down so that we know that it's true, and that the rules of engagement for using that say, yeah, we can use some of our intellectual property when we're working with this LLM because we know it's internal. One of the challenges that you'll run into, though, is a lot of software these days that have little AI models hidden in them. And so this is where we like to talk about shadow AI a little bit. There's two different aspects of shadow AI, but these are things that you want to consider when you're writing procedures and policy statements for AI as well. So what are cases where a software tool has an AI engine in it hidden, and they didn't tell you about it, and then you're asking it for information on something at your organization. It's crawling through your organization's documents, and that suddenly it's actually an LLM behind the scenes that's sending your data out for training purposes. You want to be aware of that and have some sort of review process to understand that. And the other side of it is if you don't have policy, procedure, and guidelines in place yet at your organization for AI use, you might have users out in the wild who are using these tools on their phones, on their iPads, or on their computer if your IT team hasn't locked it down. How are they using it? They're just kind of doing it off the edge of their desk. And that can be very difficult to manage without some guidelines. Really, though, your users just want help. Have mercy on them. That's where policy, procedures, and guidelines really help out. Those guideline documents give users some sense of, hey, how do I do what's best for the company when using these tools? Making those documents easy to read is going to make those users more likely to follow the rules when it comes to AI use at your organization. I talked a little bit about bias and model transparency and ethics already. Like if you're using data science models or AI tools, so not necessarily our chat GPTs of the world, but our more traditional data science and machine learning algorithms. Watch for bias. Make sure you write that into your policy. Make sure you have some statements on ethics. And because it's so popular in regulation right now, make sure you understand some model transparency and have the ability to document that into. And that brings my talk to a conclusion. I will be doing a half-day version workshop of this where I talk about policies and procedures and guidelines. But I also have some wonderful in-person exercises attached to this too that we'll be doing at the DGIQ and Enterprise Data World Conference coming up in Anaheim in May. I strongly encourage you to check out the website because boy, howdy, there's a lot of great things on that agenda, and it's going to be a grand old time. If you're interested in coming, you can save 15% off with the Mark15 coupon code, and the early bird ends this Friday. So I don't mean to pressure everybody to get in there and register right away, but I mean, you can save quite a couple of bucks by registering right now. And come and learn some more about AI governance. And there's a ton of other material that's going to be really, really spectacular at that event. So I encourage you to check it out if you haven't already. And with that, I will pass the microphone, as it were, back to Shannon for any questions and comments that people may have.
All right,
Pepper me with some good questions.
Yeah, if you have questions for Mark, feel free to put them in the Q&A panels. We've got plenty of time to get through a few questions here. I put the white paper in the link to the white paper in the chat, along with the couple of templates there, which are that, and the link to the templates are also in the white paper, so you can grab that. And just answer the most commonly asked questions. Just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email by end of day Thursday for this webinar with links to the slides and links to the recording. Right now, Mark, everyone's being shy. I can't believe it. I
Well,
told Donna on Thursday, I think I've kind of killed the mood. Like I come back on to host and everyone's like quiet. What,
well,
yeah.
one thing I'd like to highlight, well, if anybody's thinking of a question, download that white paper. There's a couple of things that I've included in there, and Shannon, I remember you and I talking about this not too long ago. I included a story in there where an AI model was had a bias issue in it. So it had actually produced a situation where it undervalued the credit scores of female clients to a bank, such that it was denying loans to women. And like those are the kinds of things you want to enshrine in policy procedures and guidelines. The fact that you're going to document certain things about how AI is used at your organization, that framework should give your company like somebody who's accountable, and the kinds of things that you're going to document about something like that. So when these kinds of events regrettably happen, they shouldn't, but if they do happen, then you know what the recourse is. You know who's going to be in front of the media. Like you know some of these basic things. And so I was fascinated by that story when I was doing a lot of research in this area. So it was a wonderful thing to include in the white papers. So take a look and check out the references.
Yeah,
Has
I've seen
anybody
we've got some questions coming in, yeah, for sure.
awesome.
So Mark, thank you for this very insightful session. And question for you, based on your experience, have you come across any publicly available AI governance policy and procedure and guidelines document like universities that you would recommend as a good starting point rather than starting from scratch?
Well, there's a number of things that I would recommend people read. Um, a friend of the program, Sunil Suarez, wrote a wonderful book on AI governance frameworks. And he talks a lot about different things to include in policy in that book. The book is huge, but the very beginning of that, he's got real life examples of different things that impacted organizations in different ways that policy frameworks had helped resolve those. So I can't recommend his content enough, and it's free. I think Shannon, we probably have links to that somewhere. We can include that when we email out to everybody, right? The link to his book from Your Data Connect. But he'll also be at DGIQ and EDW at our conference coming up in May, and really really smart fellow, and he's just coming out with a new book right away here, or he just did on related to AI ethics and shadow AI, I think was his newest one. So yeah, I recommend that. There's not a lot of folks who have published specific frameworks local to their organizations, but there are a lot of groups that have pushed out frameworks that you can look at. So like NIST is a good example. Microsoft and AWS both have frameworks. There have been a lot of people that have written literature on this, but it's all like thought leadery stuff, which is wonderful to read and consider when you're developing things. But I always like to have something that's or at least reference something that was actually practicable and practiced at an organization to really sink my teeth into and see how that actually happened in the real world. So there's a little bit of that, and those cases are tough to find. People are kind of meandering through this right now. Even us cool kids are kind of meandering through it right now too. So there's not a lot of wonderful examples out there, but there's a lot of framework guidance that you can find on the internet.
And you were talking about Sunil's AI governance comprehensive book,
Yes, yes, yes.
one that you
Yeah, that's
reviewed.
the one. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'll put that in the chat as well. At least your book review, I got the and that which had a link to it. So all right. We have lots of great questions coming in now. I love it. So Mark, you haven't touched on enforcement.
Yeah. I try to be a rather positive guy. Generally, though, I do put enforcement clauses and procedures where that's applicable, but there's so many cultural factors to consider when adding that into a procedure document. I definitely don't like to have the iron boot of justice, as I colloquially call it, in the policy document because that's going to be distracting for our readers and it's bloat that doesn't need to be there. Like I've been saying, have mercy on your poor readers. They just want to know what they're supposed to do. Yeah, the enforcement definitely include that in a procedure document, especially as it relates to documenting AI model use. Put that in a procedure document. Reference it in your policy. But hey, the policy says that we will specifically document the use of LLMs at our organization, and we will document roles and expected procedures and guidelines, and then link to those procedures and guidelines. And then you can have enforcement in those child documents. That's the best place to put them because you don't want to slap people with the negative consequences of not following policy when they're just there for help. But if they need to follow a particular procedure, then they need to know the ramifications if they miss the procedure. And they're there to follow the specific rules and the specific, task items related to how they're supposed to carry out their day-to-day job. Hopefully that answered your question. I didn't meander too much.
No, it's good. So Mark, what's your favorite delivery system for documentation? Websites, wikis, etc.?
I've had in my early career, I've had a string of marvelous failures using wikis, but I've seen them work as well. I've not to promote any particular vendor, but I've been a huge fan of using SharePoint for a lot of things, mostly because it's readily available in most organizations, and I can catalog things, and I've become kind of a SharePoint whiz over the years. Um, but Really, it's more about the how you're doing things and not necessarily the tools related to it. And communication is more of something that you plan for. When I do this workshop, a workshop related to this, I talk about a communications plan. I also have a communications template and just how we're communicating with users, when we're communicating with users, how we set up training. So I get into some of those topics as well. There's a lot of magic that happens there, but um, having any kind of document management portal where you can explain and link together policies, procedures, and guidelines is good. Most organizations already have something like that in place in terms of a policy library. I've implemented these things in a business glossary before and had everything linked together and had like lineage maps that shows, hey, this data element in a database table somewhere is in this enterprise system and deals with data in this domain, and data in this domain is governed by this policy, like all in one. You can click into any of those things kind of document, which is pretty advanced and very cool and very helpful for users. But it also takes a lot of work to set up. So, I mean, I like when you're starting out and getting these things done in the first place, I like to keep things as low fidelity as possible and just focus on the communication aspects to get people aware. But that's part of why you build it as a team too, because you have a team of people who are also going to be excited about sharing the news on the policy and making sure that people read the policy. So it's not just you that's pushing everything. You've got a team of champions to help you. It's a bit of a change management trick.
I love tricks. All right. Well, we've got about 6 minutes left. We have time for a few more questions here. So, Mark, in the shop that I'm working, the data governance team doesn't have the domain expertise to take on AI governance. Have you ever seen this occur? We're thinking they need to have a separate team once that has expertise to drive AI governance. Have
Yeah.
you seen that?
Yeah, actually, I've seen it more often than not. I've seen organizations try to take their governance program and governance policies and kind of wrap AI governance into that policy framework. I've seen that kind of start to work. Ask me again in a couple months when that's happened for longer, because again, a lot of this is pretty new. But it's AI governance is a different thing. So while your roles and responsibilities may have similar look feel to governance-y roles and responsibilities, how it interacts in your organization and the types of activities you might do as an AI governance team and how you support the business might be quite a bit different. Um, my pithy answer is going to be it depends. It really depends on the cultural factors in your organization. But more often than not, I've seen organizations, because I talked to quite a few people now, where they're like, yeah, no, we need a separate team for this. Like our governance team, they're not equipped to handle this. It's going to be different enough. Let's set up a separate framework. And that's okay. That realization is going to get you places, but it's going to depend on the reality on the ground at your organization. So sorry I didn't illuminate the perfect answer for you, but yeah, it's definitely something to think about.
Great. So which department is typically responsible for writing these kinds of policy? Is it data governance? Is it HR?
That depends as well. So there's a lot of cultural factors that go in there. So it's going to depend on how the executive at your organization uh, demanded that AI governance be something that's supported by a policy framework. That's going to illuminate who the policy lead is. So I believe I've got that in the policy template, who the policy lead is. And that's the person who's going out there. I'm hoping that's everybody on this call. Maybe it is. You're the one out there making sure we've got all the right people in the room, coordinating all the activity, writing the first draft, getting everybody to work independently on it, and building that collaborative uh, uh, working group to get the policy approved. It's going to be different at every organization. I could see it like having worked on so many different policies, procedures, and guidelines in my career, like over the last 30 years. Um, it's going to depend on the subject matter for that and where it's coming from in your organization. So it depends again, but that answer should illuminate itself as you start working on it.
Perfect. And we got 3 minutes of time for at least one more. We can do it.
Okay.
Can you expand on policy and procedures or guidelines for employees on AI prompts?
Yeah, and this is actually something I've done my hand at drafting a little bit for a friend of mine. Because like prompts are interesting, and so when we talk about a policy framework, we can have a high level policy that says, yeah, we can use our company encourages the use of these tools or this kind of LLM or whatever you want to put in your policy document, but have a procedure document that links to or a guideline document that talks about what acceptable use is. What are the rules of engagement for using that tool? Um, and that is a decent spot to either at least reference or put right in the guideline document the kinds of things that employees can use can do with prompts. So in that kind of document, you may say, don't include any personal identifiable information of customers. Anything that's confidential, don't include in the prompt. Here is a link to some resources on how to write effective prompts to do this type of activity or this type of activity. So when I was saying that the magic sauce to making this a readable set of documents to folks is to reference things, like put in your guideline document, you can say reference all of these different prompt engineer type of resources that you found on the internet. There's a lot of good ones out there, but it's going to depend on what model you're using in your organization. But I like to kind of shove that or shunt that stuff off to guidelines, because that's where I want my users who are just coming here for help and they want to know what the rules of engagement are. I want them to read that guideline document. And if I've got nice links off to good resources there, they're going to feel helped by that document. Ultimately, I want users to feel helped and assisted by reading policy, procedure, and guidelines.
Oh, a perfect timing, Mark. And then, of course, we had just so many amazing questions come in, but I'm afraid that is all the time we have for. So thanks to everybody for being so engaged and joining in and being involved in everything we do. Just a reminder, I will send a follow-up email to everybody, again, with links to the white paper, as well as the slides and the recording from today. Mark, thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, chat, for being so electric. A lot of messages whipped by my eyeballs, and I didn't even see them all. So good job, everybody.
I'll make sure you get a copy so you can view. And I hope to see everybody in Anaheim. It's going to be so much fun. So I
If,
hope,
if you do come to Anaheim, come say hi at the very least.
absolutely. All right, y'all. Have a great day.